Hello and welcome to a short preview then for the French election happening this weekend. Having a look at a few scenarios and how the market might react when the results start to come in on Sunday evening. First of all, let's just have a look at the setup of the polls and what they're indicating. And what you can see here are four main candidates. There are more than that are running for this first round presidential race. However, really, they're the front runners, and there's such a big distance that we're discounting the rest and we're focusing on these four. Now, quite interestingly is the chap at the bottom, the red line, Mélenchon, who's the furthest left-leaning politician. And what you can see there is due to a very strong performance that he's put in the live televised debates. There's been 3 over the last few weeks. He's actually surged from being a real outsider. He does have very radical reformist views on a number of key issues. Irrespective of that, he's actually climbed up to match pretty much François Fillon, who's the former French Prime Minister. Now, Fillon has been a fairly steady candidate. He had a bit of pressure from various allegations that came his way via illegitimate government funds that were said to have been spent on his own family members. But he seems to have shaken that off, and actually in the last few days he's actually risen back into contention. And that might well be that he is he's a person that people are very familiar with. And apart from the scandals that came about a few months ago, he is someone who has a very large staple backing of one of the biggest political movements, the Republican Party in the country. So certainly you would be remiss to discount him at this point. The two people, though, that are most likely, according to the polls, to go through are the most newest candidate of the four, that being Macron with his new party. He is the most inexperienced of the four. He is a former investment banker. He's only 39 years old. He is the most pro-European friendly, and so by default then he is seen as the most positive in terms of how European assets might react if he were to win. Le Pen obviously is a person you're probably very familiar with. This really encapsulates this wave of populism that's been ongoing across the planet with the various other votes that we've seen, with Trump now president, with Britain voting for Brexit. Le Pen is kind of that figure. The manifesto very much built on the idea of the immigration issue and regaining sovereignty of the country and so on and so forth. But most importantly, anti-EU, and would want to call for a referendum for exit, a Frexit as they call it in the press. So this is a very interesting Bloomberg article, and there's a few things here definitely we should talk about. One is here, this graphic, Macron's support has strengthened more than any other candidate. So Macron really has come out of nowhere over the last few months, but he has put in, he is kind of the greater centre argument to cover most bases as a more credible candidate. Is kind of where he's captured a lot of support. Fillon, though, being and Le Pen very well established campaigners, they have actually a largest amount of people who are very sure that they're going to back those certain politicians. If you think about the political spectrum, those on the very furthest right-leaning and the very furthest left tend to be very sure of their opinion. Those who are more centrist candidates tend to struggle more to encapsulate the overall sentiment and feeling of the public, particularly in this populist movement that's been present in other countries. It's almost like the anti-establishment or the protest vote, and so those that are more right-leaning have been the ones that have gained more traction recently. Hence, there is a greater risk around this result, and Le Pen probably has her best chance ever that she's had in recent political campaigns. Other things to have a look at here that's quite interesting is actually the turnout. And a lower turnout would probably equate to being more beneficial for Le Pen, given the fact of possibly the demographic of the type of people that are more likely to back her might be older. That was certainly a similar situation to the EU referendum, where younger people were much more pro-Remain in Europe, whereas older people were much more pro-Britain, and so therefore default to leave the EU. And so with this situation, the average general election turnout is about 78%. And one of the most interesting things here is that some of the latest data would suggest in polls that about 40% of voting people in France are still undecided on who they're going to back. So if you remember that last chart we just looked at, if 40% are undecided, majority of those you would say are probably potential Macron people that are undecided. Those who are very sure Le Pen, they're already there. And so actually it wouldn't take many more to then shift into Fillon or Le Pen to actually discount Macron, irrespective of the fact that he's leading the polls. This is interesting though in regards to the math. Millions of voters are required to win by turnout scenario. So the National Front votes in 2015 regional elections, we're looking pretty low. This is kind of the benchmark 50% level. The record low turnout in 1969 general election was 64%. The average much higher at 78%. The anti-EU vote in 2005. And so the actual timings of the participation rates could be a key trading opportunity if the markets were open. In this case, those timings are going to come at midday French time on Sunday, so right in the middle of the day when the votes are in, and also 5 p.m. local time. That's when you're going to get a percentage probably circulate on Twitter and the news agencies about what the percentage is of the turnout. The higher the number, I would say, the more favourable for someone like Macron. The lower the number, the more favourable for someone like Le Pen and probably Fillon. This is quite interesting as it shows briefly the timeline of Fillon. So he was actually probably the most popular candidate at the time before the elections hit, so towards Q4 of 2016, 29%. He then dropped substantially as those allegations came against him, but he's currently managed to claw back some of those losses back to around the 20% margin going off today's polls. Le Pen, who he has to overtake, he only needs to capture another small proportion of the vote. And historically, if we go back over different countries and different electoral patterns, people often tend to vote with what they know when it comes down to actually the voting booth on the day. And so again, not to discount Fillon is what this is telling you. The opposite case would be further traction for the far left. Now Benoit Hamon, who's the kind of in-between of centre-left Macron and far-left Mélenchon, he's kind of lost a lot of ground, only 7.1%, so he's very unlikely to make it through to the second round. But do his left-leaning support go to back further left-leaning Mélenchon? If that were to be the case, actually that's how Mélenchon could win. Most would suggest though that people on Hamon's party would abstain rather than back someone of such a far left nature as Mélenchon, and so Mélenchon would have to pull it out the bag with his own support backing him. So some quite interesting things to just bear in mind, and what I want to quickly look at here is some of the market pricing. This is the CAC 40, and this has seen a gradual upward trend in the French stock index over the last 2 months. Despite the slight drop-off that we've had more recently, you could argue then that the market has been fairly dismissive of the risk associated with an outsider winning this event. Complacency is a word you've often heard from traders in the last few days. And actually, the PMI data we had this morning, the French business activity is currently tracking at a 6-year high, so certainly not much evidence of nervousness there. But if we were to look at the likes of the French 10-year yield spread over Germany, that has been widening, which would be indicative of some nervousness in the market has been building. You've also seen here the blue line, which is euro-dollar 1 week implied volatility. So people who are basically positioning themselves for large bouts of volatility. Remember, whatever the situation, there will be a knee-jerk movement when the markets reopen on Sunday night, and then probably will carry through into Monday morning. The question will be, will it be a moderate relief rally, or would it be worst case scenario and a very aggressive knee-jerk gap lower when the markets get underway? If you're looking at the Eurostoxx, so the main stock index encompassing all of Europe, that volatility index has also been rising. but it has also been rising on the back of the Syrian-Korean geopolitical tensions, which have been rising, as well as now this French election upcoming. So a couple things there, food for thought. And just going back to the charts, I guess we have to look at a couple of things to kind of determine how best to trade this event. And so first of all, I want to talk about timing, because timing is really key. And so the exit poll for the first round is set to be released at 7 o'clock our time, London time. The polling stations are closing an hour later than previous elections, and as such, the projected result should come an hour later than at 8 o'clock local time. Now, I've spoken to some contacts in France. How this will be released is not like what you get with all the individual constituencies coming out to then gauge this kind of fluid throughout the evening kind of US election swing state or a Sunderland-Newcastle Brexit situation. What it will be in France is at that point, there's really two things you need to look for. One will be initial exit polls. When that exit poll comes out, that could be very telling already for what the end result is if it's very clear that Macron and Le Pen are going through. The alternative here is that if it's very close, you would then have to wait for the partial result, which gets released at around 8 o'clock our time London. And then how it will be released is that national television will basically flash two people that have gone through, and then it will go through and say which individual areas of France voted for what. But you will know immediately who the final two are, and that's all that counts in terms of the markets will be concerned. The actual, if it's a very close race, you will know the data as it gets more accurate when the final results start getting accumulated the hours thereafter, so probably 9, 10 o'clock. By then, all of the financial markets will start reopening as we go into late Sunday night, and you'll either get that knee-jerk reaction higher or lower. In a relief rally situation, a knee-jerk reaction higher would be if it's Le Pen and Macron, given that Macron then is very much expected to win in the second round by around a 30 percentage point difference. Don't forget the polling margin of error for Brexit was only 6.4%, so 30% most would believe is insurmountable for the second round. And whereas the difference though between Macron and Le Pen could be telling to how big the relief rally is in for assets like the euro-dollar pair, or in the DAX index and the CAC Quarante European indices and so on. On the other side, if it is a situation where you get Macron filant, Le Pen doesn't make it through, I would say that is a very small probability of that happening. That's Le Pen not going through. I think that she will probably be the most popular candidate in this first round. If it's Macron filant, that's the most positive market friendly situation. Both then would maintain largely a status quo in terms of European policies and reform and so forth. In terms of the worst case scenario that would cause the biggest depreciation of European assets, that would be Eurodollar gapping sharply lower, DAX European equities gapping, and then when they open, this is in the morning, when the cash markets open, probably coming under severe selling pressure, would be if if Le Pen and Mélenchon both go through, given their anti-European stances. Just having a quick look at the euro currency, in that scenario, there's quite a key technical level which was tested, which was that double bottom that we had really defining 2015, and we tested briefly just below at the end of last year, beginning of this year, and it was just sub the 104 level. I'm looking at euro futures here on a monthly candlestick chart. Certainly that would come under pressure, and I would imagine in a scenario if it was those two EU skeptics going through, then parity would probably be one of the bigger calls that the market will be looking for in a continuation of pressure, because this isn't just about France in that situation. Then probably the fear of the euro breakup under these scenarios would spread to the likes of Italy, to the likes of the German federal elections later this year, and so on and so forth. It would cause short-term chaos in the market in that respect. Okay, a few other points I quickly want to touch upon in regards to general assessing the event itself, and then also what some of the banks are looking for, just to round things up. Obviously there's a large amount of undecided people. That makes this a particularly interesting event, meaning that there's a great degree of people could be swayed at the very last moment. Obviously we had the the appalling news of another terror attack in Paris yesterday on the Champs-Élysées. Will that carry any weight is yet to be seen. And certainly over the weekend, I'm sure security will be extremely high in Paris. Other things are a high abstention rate, i.e. people not voting, could boost Le Pen and Fillon because they have the biggest kind of traditional backing by their political parties. The two-round system is also interesting because what it does or could cultivate is a protest vote just to make the point. But then when it comes down to the second vote, which happens in early May, the dynamics changes quite radically. And so it's important to understand that even if Le Pen is a big outright winner in the first round, that doesn't technically mean that she's going to be the president. She is substantially below Macron, Fillon and even Mélenchon in terms of actually winning the actual vote. She needs to cultivate almost double her traditional supporting, which is multiple millions have then got to turn far right, which is probably unlikely. Other things to keep an eye on are that when she goes through to the second round, she probably is going to be less favourable given the fact that her ideas remain generally in the minority. Don't forget, most French people on balance as a country are pro-Europe, not anti-Europe, of which she is, wanting to call for an EU referendum to exit the euro area. Other things are someone like Benoît Hamon is suffocating between Mélenchon and Macron. Basically, he's failed to tweak his primaries manifesto, is what some of the journalists at Bloomberg have been quoting, that he hasn't managed to differentiate himself from the other candidates who the voting public were very disappointed in their performance in the previous administrations. And so therefore, those candidates would either move to Macron support or Mélenchon at that point. Okay, so looking at it from a bank interpretation and what some of the analysts are looking at, some of the things that I've read is that Deutsche Bank suggests there will be a limited scope for a relief rally, given the fact that European assets, generally speaking, have been largely unfazed when you're looking at the case of outright in the euro-dollar pair, and also especially where we are in European equities. But slightly longer term, on the conclusion of the actual whole event itself, including the second round, people like JP Morgan suggest the return of global investor flows could lift equities a double-digit percentage. Morgan Stanley suggesting that banking names could rally quite aggressively, French names that is, so BNP, SocGen. Nomura suggesting in the currency market, euro-dollar could rise 1%, UBS looking for around a 2% increase. These are fairly small levels on the upside. The bigger risk, of course, is someone like Mélenchon would see a very negative knee-jerk reaction in equities. He's talked about shortening the working week considerably, promotion of workers' rights, denouncement of executive rights, taxing of the rich to 100%, renationalisation of EDF. All these things would be met very negatively by the equity market if he was to go through. That's aside from the fact that he too also is calling for quite radical reforms in Europe, and if plan A doesn't work, then plan B would be to call a referendum to exit Europe. So hopefully that gives you a bit of an idea, a snapshot of what we're looking out for. So really you're going to have to be tuned to things like Twitter would be a pretty good place for obtaining, I would say, sentiment gauges of how it looks like the vote is going. You're going to get those participation rates at 12 and 5 p.m. local time on Sunday ahead of the actual closing. Then you get the exit poll. That could be really key to ascertain the end result. If it's very close, then you're going to have to wait for the actual preliminary result to come out, which will be then an immediate announcement of the two people before it factors in all the different regions. But it's the two that we're concerned about. Do we get what's expected by the polls, that being a Macron-Le Pen situation, and we come in Monday, the markets breathe a sigh of relief that the worst has not materialized? Or do we get Fillon, almost like a phoenix from the flames? He comes back, and actually when it comes down to it, the people of France feel as though they want to go with the most stable kind of character that they've known, who fits the centre-right view, because they have a lack of faith in what is largely an inexperienced politician in Macron? Or do we get the most negative market scenario, which would be Mélenchon, Le Pen. So the centrists are out, and we move back to the anti-European stance. Okay, gonna leave it at that. As you can see, the lights have gone out. They're telling me to go home. So I'm gonna wish you a pleasant weekend. And if you're gonna trade on Sunday night, I wish you all the best of luck. I'll be in early on Monday morning to deliver the briefing, and we'll go through all of the results in full. So take care of yourselves, have a great weekend, and I'll see you on Monday. Thank you.